Hi, and welcome back. Today we're going to finish up the second half of chapter 3.9, and we're going to look at late modern art. We're going to look at art up through the 1960s from where we left off in the first half of the chapter. And today we're going to be looking at a lot of American art. Now, as we talked about last time, we haven't seen a whole bunch of American art up until really the 20th century. And the main reason for that is American art was very, very derivative of European art. And while there are some really, really good American artists, there was nobody who was doing anything like super distinctive that was separate from sort of what had come before. American artists were trained in a European sort of way. Many American artists actually went to Europe to study, and some of them even worked primarily in Europe. So, what I mean by good American art is American art, or art that reflects sort of American ideas, American style, that could only come from American culture and isn't just an imitation of European culture or any of the other roots of American art, and that will also include African American culture. And so what we start to see in the 1920s, 1930s, is this distinctive sort of style of American art that is sort of taking European avant-garde modernism, it's taking African-American influences, it's taking a bunch of different sort of things and mixing them together to create something distinctly American. Now, by the time we get to the mid-1940s, the United States and the world have gone through World War I and World War II. And World War II is even more devastating than World War I was. We talked about the effects of World War I in the last chapter, something like 14 million dead. Well, the mortalities in World War II is almost triple that. It's over 40 million people who died in World War II. It's an incredibly devastating war, and even bigger than the previous World War. And during the war, a lot of the great sort of cultural and art capitals of Europe were either severely bombed, or they were occupied by the Nazis or other various forces, or they weren't producing art because the world was at war. And the sort of capital of the art world, Paris, was occupied by the Nazis. So the once sort of glittering capital of the Western art world was no longer that glittering capital of the Western art world. But London itself had been bombed. Many of the great Italian cities were under, the fascist ruler Mussolini. So things aren't looking good for European art. And America at this point, sort of on the world stage, is ascendant, right? We are gaining in economic power, we're gaining in military power, we're gaining in cultural influence. America is becoming in many ways the sort of economic focus of the world, and for our purposes we're going to see America is also becoming the cultural capital of the world. And we saw that starting to begin when we looked last time at the Harlem Renaissance and the influence of jazz and tap dance and also the other various offshoots of jazz that are starting to influence the world. And so people are looking to America as sort of the cliche, as this sort of land of opportunity. What also happens during World War II is many Europeans, especially Jews, but many Europeans in general, flee Europe and come to America. And a lot of avant-garde artists are part of that group. And so what we're getting in America is a lot of expat European artists sort of bringing these modernist influences with them. Along with that, we still have the ubiquitous African-American artistic influence, as well as other sort of homegrown American styles of art. And that leads us to the artist of this painting, a guy named Jackson Pollock. And love or hate Jackson Pollock's style, we can't get away from his importance as an artist and especially as an American artist, because in many ways Jackson Pollock is the guy who puts American art on the world map. And he does it through a very divisive style of art called abstract expressionism. His particular brand of abstract expressionism is called action painting, because the actions of the artist are what are emphasized. But Jackson Pollock was this sort of kind of rebellious sort of figure. He was not your traditional kind of art background, although he did receive formal training, and he actually studied under the muralist William Hart Benton. But what makes Jackson Pollock sort of unique is that he's from the American West. He was born in Cody, Wyoming. And the way he presented himself wasn't sort of as a typical artist. He was this kind of hard-drinking, hard-living kind of guy. He'd go out and get into fistfights in bars and that kind of stuff. The way he dressed was often wearing jeans and a t-shirt, or while he was working, he would often wear like coveralls with work boots. Jackson Pollock painted in a really unique style. Instead of painting on an easel with a canvas stretched on a frame, which was the traditional method, he laid out massive canvases, 10, 15, 20 feet long and wide canvases without priming them onto the ground. And then he would, instead of using sort of tubes of paint, he would use industrial paint. He used automotive paint and house paint. In fact, somebody asked him very famously once why he used these industrial paints, and he said, well, if it's good enough for Ford, it's good enough for me. So there's this kind of bigger-than-life American attitude just in the way Pollock talked to the press and just the way he sort of presented himself, and that sort of plays out in his art too, which is big and bold and sort of is meant to challenge basically every kind of rule ever laid out. So instead of painting on an easel, he paints on the ground. Instead of painting sort of smaller paintings, as was the sort of the fashion at the time, he paints massive academic-sized paintings. Instead of using traditional paints, he's using these modern industrial kinds of paints. Jackson Pollock developed his style really as a way of dealing with his alcoholism in many ways. Jackson Pollock was a severe alcoholic. In fact, it's going to end his life when he kills himself and two passengers in a horrible accident related to his driving while intoxicated. And so Pollock was in and out of therapy for a lot of his life, trying to battle his alcoholism. And in therapy, he started to learn about the subconscious, and he started to learn about this sort of idea that if you sort of shut off the conscious mind, you can maybe contact something deeper within you, and maybe something even spiritual, maybe something not just deeper in you, but sort of deeper within sort of the entirety of the universe. I know this sounds kind of cosmic and hippie-ish, but bear with me. So Pollock is saying that, inside of all of us maybe is this sort of universal kind of truth, and if we kind of shut ourselves off, we can access it. Unfortunately, this didn't work to cure his alcoholism, but it did lead to this new way of painting that he called action painting. And the way Jackson Pollock would work is he would lay out these canvases on the ground and then take his brushes, or sometimes he'd even take a stick, and instead of brushing the paint on, he would drip the paint. In fact, the press ended up calling him Jack the Dripper because of this technique. And so Jackson Pollock, though, would almost go into kind of a spiritual sort of trance. In fact, he said that a big influence on his art was the art of the Navajo people of the southwest United States. And the Navajo were known for creating what were called sand paintings. And these were paintings made by dripping different colored pieces of sand, or colored grains of sand, onto the ground and making patterns and designs out of it. And then after the ritual was over, the paintings were destroyed because the paintings were thought to sort of collect evil spirits. And so by destroying the painting, you destroy the spirits. But Pollock takes this idea because for him, the act of painting in itself is almost like a religious experience. It's sort of like performing a religious ritual. And he would almost go into these kind of trance-like sort of states where he's sort of picking things at random from, picking paints at random and not really thinking about what he's going to be painting next, but sort of moving with the flow of the universe, man. But, see what I'm saying? He feels like he's connecting into this greater, bigger thing than he is. And he puts this very clearly in an interview where he says, I want to express my emotions, not illustrate them. And so let's think about that. Let's think about what that means to illustrate one's emotions. It means that you are literally making a picture. So if I wanted to make a picture of anger, I could draw an angry face, right? But if I wanted to express anger, I would punch somebody in the face, right? So that's the difference. Pollock wants to express his emotions physically and let them sort of come out on the canvas. Now, either you buy this or you don't, but a lot of people started to. In fact, I think the best way to think about Pollock's art is to think about a story that may or may not be completely true. But as with a lot of these kinds of myths or semi-myths about artists, I think there's truth even if it didn't actually happen. And here's the story. So when Pollock goes to New York, he starts working, he meets a woman named Peggy Guggenheim. Guggenheim is a very married to a very powerful industrialist, and she is a supporter or a patron, or I should say, I guess, matron of the arts. Think of her as, in a way, sort of like the Medici family of modernist New York art in the middle of the 20th century. And she takes Pollock and she gets him a studio and gets him a job and all this stuff. And one day she comes to his studio, and it's very cold. It's New York in the winter. And she goes to his studio and she sees that he's taken one of his paintings and he's wadded it up and he's wrapped it around a hot water heater to keep it insulated. And she's sort of flipping out a bit. She's invested a lot of money in this guy and in his work. And she says, "What are you doing to your work?" And he looks at her, and the famous story goes, he says, "That is not my work. My work ended as soon as I put the brush down. What you see on the canvas are more like footsteps in the sand that recorded where I walked. But it was the actual walking that's important," right? I'm kind of mixing some metaphors here, but I think you get the idea, right? For him, the action of painting is the art. And what he leaves on the floor is just a record of that performance, that ritual, that moment, whatever you want to call it. And Pollock and the abstract expressionists, and there were others, people were more interested in them as a novelty. It was just something new and weird. In fact, Life magazine published a multi-page article on him. And this is really what sort of brings real attention and, even more importantly, money into Jackson Pollock, is that this article, which was, sort of talked about his methods and everything, intrigued the nation. People who either thought, well, he's the biggest scam artist of all time, or this guy's insane. But whatever your opinion was, it was fascinating. Because Pollock represented something new. And he represented, especially to people outside of the United States, what was attractive about America and American culture. His art was big, and it was bold, and it was new, and it was different than anything else, and it sort of shocked the traditional art world. It broke every single rule. And like American culture, it was big and brash and kind of manly and, oftentimes what we think of sort of a mid-century modern person. And here's Pollock, not with tiny little tubes of oil paint and a little delicate brush painting on a canvas, but instead stomping around with a flask of whiskey in his back pocket, a cigarette in his mouth, throwing paint at the damn canvas, and then going out and getting drunk and getting into a fist fight, right? This is sort of like the cowboy version of the artist, and he sort of embodies everything that people found intriguing about American culture. Now, he's not the only abstract expressionism, and action painting is not the only kind of abstract expressionism. Action painting, it is all about action, isn't it? It emphasizes movement of the body and the marks that are made when paint it leaves your hand or whatever. But there is another sort of branch of abstract expressionism called color field. And this artist, Mark Rothko, is probably the most well-known, although we're going to look at another I like a little better, but that's okay. But Mark Rothko, and you can see his quote here, he says, "I'm not an abstractionist. I'm not interested in the relationship of color or form or anything else. I'm interested only in expressing," there's that word again, "basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on." So what does this mean? It means that, like Pollock, he doesn't want to make a picture of what he's feeling. He wants to express it through, in this case, through color. He's not expressing it through the action of his movements. He's expressing it through these big fields of color, because like Vasily Kandinsky before him, 30 years earlier or whatever, he believes that to express abstract emotions, you have to paint them abstractly. So how do you paint sadness? What does sadness look like? What does happiness look like? What does doom? What does doom look like? For Rothko, it's expressed in color. And he would use these big fields of color. And he'd paint on a massive scale. He's painting, 8-foot paintings here, because he wants you to almost be enveloped. He wants you to be enveloped by these colors and just sort of surround you. Okay, so Mark Rothko is sort of a slightly different take. If you want to see some Rothkos here in Texas, I highly recommend going to the Rothko Chapel in Houston. And this is a fascinating place because it's this non-denominational chapel. And, for Rothko, for him, painting was spiritual, just like it was for Pollock. But for Rothko, this color sort of connected one to the spiritual world. And he, in Houston, created a chapel called the Rothko Chapel, which is this sort of modernist building. It's a smallish chapel. It's not very big. But inside are these large purple, dark purple paintings. They look black probably in this video, but believe me, they're purple. And there's a skylight above, but it's sort of blocked by this big diffuser that diffuses the light. And so when you stand in here, as the earth moves around the sun and the light sort of ebbs and flows with passing clouds and other factors, this brings out different aspects of the paintings. And so dark purples or light purples or different patterns will emerge as you sort of sit there in a state, the idea is you're sitting here in sort of a state of meditation or prayer or reverence or whatever your sort of religious beliefs require. But the idea is that this is, whatever your beliefs are, this building is meant to sort of aid you into achieving a connection with the spiritual world. I hope maybe that clarifies some things. Because I will admit, guys, we're getting into weird territory here. We're getting into art that is not about... The art is not about what it pictures, but it's about how it was made and what the artist was doing and thinking while they made it. That's weird, and that's okay if you're sitting there going, what the... because for many years I sat there and went, what the... But think about, I find, abstract expressionism at some levels fascinating though, because in a way it's sort of like watching the DVD extras or the Blu-ray extras of a movie. And it's one thing to see a movie, but it's another thing once you realize how it's made, and it can bring a deeper appreciation to the work. And that's in some ways what you have to do when you're looking at abstract expressionism. You have to sort of think about the methods and the way these works were constructed, and maybe even more importantly, what was going on through the artist's mind, or at least trying to piece that together. Another color field artist is Helen Frankenthaler, and she worked in a very sort of cool way. She, like Pollock and Rothko, she worked big. Most abstract expressionists did. This isn't dainty, delicate art. This is big, crazy stuff. And Frankenthaler would use these huge, like, sheets of canvas, and it would require multiple people to hold the corners of these canvases. So she's, has a piece, imagine this is a big canvas, and then she would pour different color paints in it, and then move the paints around and let them sort of pool and flow where they were going to. And in a lot of ways, she is also relying on chance. And once again, she's almost treating the creation of art as a kind of ritual, or even with Frankenthaler, it's almost more like a group activity. It's almost a way of sort of bonding with somebody else and kind of coordinating their actions with your actions. Kind of cool, right? And then there's Andy Warhol and the pop artist. Okay, so pop art. Pop art is a movement that begins in New York in the 1960s. And in many ways, pop art is a reaction against abstract expressionism. The whole idea of abstract expressionism is that at its core, it's an art that takes itself very seriously. The idea is that it's almost a kind of religious ritual, or maybe even a kind of therapy. But the idea is that the artist is sort of expressing something deep and meaningful through their actions, and tapping into something primal and special and important, maybe universally important. And the artists are often very mercurial sorts of individuals. Jackson Pollock and his fight with alcoholism that ends in his untimely death. Mark Rothko, despite his sort of desire for spiritual peace, committed suicide. These are artists who often, struggled with some serious problems, emotional problems, mental problems, etc. But then on the flip side, you have pop art, which in many ways is a reaction to abstract expressionism. The idea behind pop art is that you want to paint and sculpt and create things that reflect ideas and concepts and the world, other things in the world that are popular. Pop art, that's what it means. And pop art celebrates the normal and the everyday consumer culture of American society in the 1960s and 1970s. In fact, while some pop art maybe in some ways kind of skews or makes fun of or trolls popular culture a little bit, and consumer culture a little bit, at the same time, these artists loved it. And no artist represents pop art more than Andy Warhol. And you guys are going to watch a video on Andy Warhol this week, so I'm not going to go super in depth, but I cannot talk about Andy Warhol because he is hugely influential. He's one of the most important artists of the 20th century, and arguably of all time. And love him or hate him, his ideas are incredibly influential. So to give you an idea of, let's just talk about Warhol. Warhol comes from a Polish family. He was raised very strictly Eastern Orthodox. In fact, he was a very religious guy and sort of carried that faith with him. I think he actually even paid for a relative to go to seminary at one point. So, but at the same time, this was a guy who very much celebrated the modern world and popular culture. And instead of coming from a fine art background like Pollock and many of the abstract expressionists did, Andy Warhol came from a commercial art background. He trained at the Carnegie Institute in their commercial design department, and his whole goal was to become a, well, commercial artist. And in fact, his earliest work was designing greeting cards for well, it was designing greeting cards and shopping bags and things like that, advertisements. Andy Warhol was very close to his mother, and this work, called 25 Cats Named Sam and One Blue Pussy, is a work he did somewhat in collaboration with his mom, and the name actually came from his mother. Although it should say 25 Cats Named Sam, but she misspelled it. She made an error and said 25 Cats Named Sam, and he sort of liked that. He thought it was cute, and he kept it. And so one of Andy Warhol's first published works was a collection of postcards with colorful kitty cats on them. So if this, I hope this clues you in that pop artists are doing something radically different than the abstract expressionists. Abstract expressionism is about bearing your soul through sort of almost violent action on to the canvas, so you can maybe discover a sort of deeper meaning within inside yourself. And Andy Warhol was on the other side of New York making cute, colorful pictures of kitty cats. So very, very different. Andy Warhol really hits it big in 1962 when he starts producing multiple images of products. The image on the right is one of his most famous early works, his green Coca-Cola bottles. And he did variations of these objects throughout his career. The other one is, of course, the Mona Lisa. But basically, Andy Warhol says, that we live in a world of consumer goods, of pop culture. We live in a world of grocery stores and Coca-Cola and Campbell's Soup and celebrities. And instead of finding that stuff trivial, he found that's what American culture is. I mean, if you want to understand America, understand the Coca-Cola bottle. If you want to understand America, understand Marilyn Monroe. Because that's what we are. We make stuff that people buy. That is American culture. And for him, there's something beautiful about this. In fact, here's a great quote. He says, "What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same as the poorest." And this is sort of in opposition to what was going on in Europe, where you have these very strict class structures, and, what the rich were having for dinner was not what the poor were having for dinner, right? Keep that in mind. But he says you can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coke, and Liz Taylor drinks Coke, and just think, you can drink Coke too. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is buying. All the Cokes are the same, and all the Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it. So, what some people said American culture was shallow, and it was all about making money, and it was all about mass producing things that were cheap and didn't matter. And for Warhol, there's something beautiful and egalitarian about this. The fact that we all drink the same drinks, the fact that we all drive the same cars, we all, we all drive Fords and Hondas, right? The fact that we all drive, the fact that we all go see the same movies, right? The fact that everybody, today in modern culture, we all have, everybody has the same phones. You either have an Android or an iPhone, and it doesn't matter whether you're a billionaire or you can barely rub, two nickels together. We have the same stuff, and that, in a weird way, this consumerism unites us. There's almost something utopian in Andy Warhol's vision here that I find sort of intriguing. But Andy Warhol wasn't just interested in mass products like his very famous Campbell's Soup cans, because let's step back a bit. Andy Warhol believed that you should he wanted to produce art the way Campbell Soup made Campbell Soup, or the way Coca-Cola made Coca-Cola. He wanted to mass produce these images. In fact, Warhol even called his studio in Greenwich Village in New York the factory. And he, instead of using traditional painting techniques, he often used silkscreen printmaking techniques and other mass production techniques to mass produce these images. But unlike Campbell Soup or Coca-Cola or whatever it is, when he would mass produce something, he would often let the equipment get dirty. He would let the screens gunk up with ink. And as you can see that here in the Mona Lisa image, which are called 30 or Better Than One, which if any title of an Andy Warhol piece describes his attitude, boy oh boy, I think it's this one, because America is, our motto is not less is more, it's more is more. And Andy Warhol's like, why have one Mona Lisa when you can have 30? And that's his attitude towards everything. And also in Andy Warhol's world, anything can be bought and sold, even the great masterpieces like the Mona Lisa. Everything's a commodity to Andy Warhol. But he wants to mass produce things. But I think Andy Warhol's most interesting works have to deal with celebrities, because Andy Warhol was obsessed with celebrities, and none more than the most famous celebrity of the time, Marilyn Monroe, and still one of the most famous celebrities and recognizable faces, I would say, is Marilyn Monroe. And like with his Campbell Soup and Coca-Cola bottles, Andy Warhol mass-produced Marilyn Monroe's image, because why have one Marilyn Monroe when you can have dozens and dozens of Marilyn Monroes, or thousands or millions of Marilyn Monroe. And Andy Warhol understood that celebrities, in a way, are like commodities. Celebrities are like Campbell Soup or Coca-Cola. We buy and we consume them. We, think about our culture today with Instagram. How many celebrity Instagrams do you subscribe to, right? We consume their lives the same way we consume Coca-Cola or whatever your drink of choice. Some of you are Dr. Pepper people. I'm not here to offend you. But, I love this diptych of Marilyn Monroe. Diptych means two panels. One's in color, one's in black and white. But Marilyn Monroe, of course, many of you recognize her. Most of you probably recognized her. And yet, I would imagine many of my younger students probably couldn't name a Marilyn Monroe movie or really tell me anything that she did, or maybe even any real aspects about her life. And that's okay, because she was a woman who, died of 60 years ago. But you recognize her face. And when you see her face, you recognize that it represents a certain kind of, sort of feminine sexuality associated especially with the 1950s and 1960s. And it's this iconic image, her face is, that you can never really forget, even though you may not know anything about her personally, that she had a very tragic life, that she died by taking too many pills, and that this was a woman who had really struggled with depression and her own self-image, and who had a lot of problems. And so there's something subtle going on in these two pictures. We see the Marilyn that we all know and love, this bright, colorful, almost iconic sort of image that is more like the label on a can of Campbell Soup or any sort of product than it is a person. But over here we see the black and white version of Marilyn. And notice how this sort of decay that is happening with her image. And the further away, the more images we make, the more she sort of just disappears into nothing. In the same way that we've kind of lost the real Marilyn Monroe. She no longer exists. The person is no longer with us, like not just because she's dead, but because we don't care about the person. We care about the image of the person. And we consume celebrities the way we consume everything else in this country. Got kind of dark, didn't it? Now, Warhol was not the only pop artist, but these pop artists often drew from popular entertainment and popular culture, hence the name, right? Warhol drew from advertising and product design. This artist, Roy Lichtenstein, drew from comic books, a medium that, as you guys know from this class, was often treated poorly and was often looked down upon, and even in some cases thought had a negative influence on the youth of America. And Roy Lichtenstein embraces it, and he adopts this comic book style for paintings that were intended to hang in galleries and museums. And he painted in this very crisp, mechanical way. Comics are produced using a mechanical lithographic process, and he replicated that mechanical printmaking technique with his brushes. He even included the printing dots here through his using stencils. But his work often draws from art history. In fact, this image is called Girl with a Mirror. Remember Picasso's Girl with a Mirror that we saw earlier? This is a common image, actually, a common theme, I should say, throughout the history of Western European art, an image of a woman looking into a mirror. It's meant to represent vanity. It's meant to represent how beauty doesn't remain. And we see his sort of comic book take on that, and it's irreverent and funny and a little silly, and it's meant to, in some ways, kind of mock and make fun of this tradition at the same time that it's celebrating it. Here's another one. Hopeless. That's the way it should have begun, but it's hopeless. He often drew from comics. We think of comics as just superheroes, but there were comics that were more like soap operas that sort of told stories of romance and love and loss and those kinds of things. And he drew heavily from those kinds of comics. But this is one of my favorites because this is sort of making fun of the modern art world. And a lot of pop art does this. A lot of pop art celebrates at the same time as it mocks its subject. But why, Brad, darling, this painting is a masterpiece. Soon you'll have all of New York clamoring for your work. So here's this sort of stereotypical, you can almost imagine a Jackson Pollock type artist, this guy who takes himself super seriously, and here's his girlfriend saying, this is a masterpiece, you're awesome, this is great. And he's done it in this comic book style, almost as if this artist is kind of a superhero, a little full of himself, right? And there's humor here. And I think that's why pop art till this day is still so successful, because there is a sense of humor to it. But also there's a knowingness. There's a knowingness that, Andy Warhol very famously said, in the future, everybody will be famous for 15 minutes. And here we are living in a world of TikToks and Instagram and YouTube channels and YouTube personalities, and this whole sort of culture of people who can become famous from broadcasting from their living rooms or their cars or wherever it is. And Andy Warhol and the pop artists, in a way, they were creating a sort of what ended up being internet culture before internet culture. I mean, in many ways, Lichtenstein's paintings are no different than memes, or, excuse my language, or shit posting, right? They often are kind of head scratchers. They appear sort of random. They're often sort of sarcastic and make fun of the things that they're also celebrating. Sound familiar? Sound like internet culture? And the pop artists were doing this stuff in the 1960s, guys. There is truly nothing new under the sun, right? I hope you guys get that from these lectures. If anything, if you don't get anything else, please understand the technology changes, but everything remains the same. Minimalism. Minimalism is, well, this is another big hashtag sort of thing existing right now, isn't it? Minimalism, although the minimalism of today sort of more means a way of living, decluttering your life, whether it's actually removing stuff out of your house that you don't need, or sort of cutting out people that are toxic, or whatever it is. But minimalism originally is an art movement that begins in the 1960s. And this artist, Donald Judd, is a guy who is one of the big proponents of minimalism. But if you could sort of strip minimalism down to its basic concepts, that the phrase I would give you is, what you see is what you see. There's no hidden meaning in minimalism. Minimalism basically says a work of art is only made up of the materials. There is no other meaning to a work of art besides the way it's laid out and designed and what it's made with. You know, for example, a minimalist would say, this is just paint on a canvas. This is just, pink and yellow and blues and blacks and whites arranged on a canvas, painted with paint and mounted on a frame. And that's all this is. There are no people, there is no meaning, there is nothing here except an object. And we need to stop pretending that objects have meaning. Objects just exist, and so we should just appreciate them for what they are. So minimalism not only describes the style of art, which is very stripped down, and this is like truth to materials taken to the 1000th degree. So you have, minimalism is everything is stripped down to its basic sort of components. Very simple designs with no ornamentation, but also it's stripped of meaning. It has minimal meaning. And most minimalism, the early minimalism anyway, was originally sculpture. And Donald Judd and others believed painting shows something. Painting is inherently illustrative. We're always going to look for pictures of things, even if we see abstract paintings. But you will never mistake this bunch of boxes made out of metal and plexiglass on a wall for anything else besides a bunch of metal and plexiglass boxes on the wall. And that's what Donald Judd wants you to see. He's like, what you see is what you see. There's no hidden meaning here. They're just boxes. But aren't they pretty? Aren't they beautiful? Aren't they arranged well? Aren't they made well? Just appreciate it for what it is. He also wanted you to view, even though these works were made, of multiple items, he wanted the whole thing as a whole, its quality as a whole. So you're not just looking at one box, but you're looking at an arrangement together. He often used commercially manufactured materials. Oftentimes, he would design these, but then he would basically have a company, a manufacturer, create these works, because these are made in using precision equipment. These aren't handmade. They're designed by Donald Judd, but think of it as the same way an architect designs a house, but usually isn't out there with a hammer and nails building it. But the minimalists basically say there's no other meaning besides what you see. Just enjoy the object for what it is, as something beautiful. If you want to see some Donald Judds, you can head out towards Marfa, Texas. Donald Judd set up something called the Chinati Foundation out in Marfa. And every year there's actually a huge art fair out there. But he's taken this little town literally in the middle of nowhere. It's out in the middle of West Texas with nothing around there. And he has created this sort of weird place for artists to show their work. And you'll be driving out, and all of a sudden in the middle of nowhere there'll be like this weird Donald Judd piece sort of sticking out of the side of the road, like these concrete boxes he created. And his work is often meant for you to appreciate the area around the art even more. So, being in this minimalist West Texas landscape where the land is incredibly flat and almost monochromatic, sort of grayish brown with this big blue sky, it's very minimal. And then seeing these big minimal concrete cubes, sort of coming out of the ground, however tall they are, 10, 15 feet tall, is really sort of shocking and strangely beautiful. And there's no meaning here. Judd just wants to create an experience that you react to on almost a purely aesthetic level, just in the same way we just listen to music sometimes we don't look for meaning in a melody, right? We just enjoy it. When a song gets stuck in your head, and that melody won't get out of your head, it's not because maybe you like the lyrics, it's just because the melody has stuck with you and it somehow makes you like the way it feels. It's the same way in some ways with minimalism. You're just so supposed to appreciate these for what they are. Big concrete boxes. Donflavin is another minimalist artist who uses lighting. He uses industrial materials just like Donald Judd. In fact, these artists wanted to take away the artist touch. They wanted art without an artist. They had a designer but not an artist. They didn't want craftsmanship. You don't want the artist's taste in here. You don't want the artist's personality in minimalism. You want just the object itself. But he created these large installations where he would take entire rooms and line up fluorescent lights. The idea is that a simple object that has been commercially purchased can become a work of art and causes us to look at such familiar objects in a new way. So it's always about the object. It's not about the meaning. So very quickly, let's wrap up with a discussion of modern and postmodern architecture. So modernism, as you guys know, is interested in the overall design. More than meaning, it's interested in design. Straight lines, geometric shapes, direct, uncluttered, progressive. But postmodernism is often a critique of modernism. It thought modernism was too idealistic and inaccessible. I mean, think about, Rothko's red and yellow and blue squares. It's hard to get your head around, isn't it? So postmodernism is in many ways about taking past cultures and reframing them and looking at them in a new way. So here's a modernist architecture. We already saw this. This is Gerrit Rietveld's Schroder House. This is part of the style movement, the Stil, and the emphasis on geometric shape and black and white primary colors. Function is most important. It was built in a modular way, but it's very strict and severe, and it's very sort of simple and abstract in its design. It's very logical too. And logic is a big part of modern art in a lot of ways, right? Especially when you look at cubism and things like that. But postmodernist art is playful. It will take past inventions and sort of mess with them. For example, this is Michael Graves' Portland Public Services building. This is considered to be the first postmodernist building. And look what he's done here. He's basically taken the idea of a Greek Doric column. So he's taken something that's long existed, the Doric column, really in many ways the basis for so much Western architecture, and he's played with it. He's blown up that column to be half the size, half the length of the building. And in fact, if you look closely, he's kind of replicated the column here, the Doric capital of the column. So he's taken this idea of the Doric column and he's turned it into something almost silly, almost playful, almost fun. And look at the decorations he's put on the sides of this building. This is not about being boring and strict and severe, but postmodernist architecture is fun, and it will mix styles. It will mix modern art and classical architecture. You'll see postmodernist buildings that will take art from India and China and Europe and mix them together and then throw a bunch of neon lights on them. Right? The idea is, in some ways, to be playful and have fun. Postmodernism rejects the rigidity of modernism and basically says anything that has happened before is fair game. And we can, it's in many ways, postmodernism is like remix culture, right? You take a song that's gone before, and you add like an EDM beat to it and a bass drop, right? You mash up different songs and make a remix out of them or whatever. It's taking things come before and sort of messing with them. This is very much what postmodernist architecture is about. All right, guys, so that's it for today. I'll see you next chapter. Bye.